Okay. Well, good morning or evening or afternoon or whatever time it is there. All I can say is I am in on the shores of Lake Ontario where it's 2 degrees Celsius, and our presenter, Dr. Davidson, is, I believe, in Atlanta where it's 27 degrees Celsius. And I hope wherever you are, it's nice and warm. So what we're going to do here is I wanted to introduce the series a little bit, just spend a couple minutes talking about that. Then I'm going to hand over the floor to Dr. Davidson, who is going to speak for roughly 20-25 minutes. And then it will come back to me and I'll try to set the tone, ask a few questions for clarification purposes, and also to try to tease out some of the more universal significances and with questions, and then I will hand it over to potential questions from the floor. Okay, so welcome everyone, and whether live here today or on record at some asynchronous point in time, to our inaugural IAHR sponsored webinar on culturally central texts. What exactly is a cultural central text, you might well ask, to which I might respond, this is why we are all here, to develop some heuristic type to invoke Max Weber, one of the founders of the discipline of religious studies, or field of religious studies, that will enable us to understand how formative texts not only become formative, but how they operate, for whom and for what purposes after they become formative. How does authority work? What sort of interpretive strategies are at play? Such questions ideally bring us out of our intellectual silos where so many of us spend our time, and ideally allow us to talk together and to one another. What can those of us who work on the Quran or the Hadith in Islamic studies, for example, learn from people or scholars working in biblical studies, indigenous studies, constitutional studies, and classical studies, among others, and as in the case today, from a scholar of Rastafari studies and biblical studies. Perhaps this is another way of saying that changes in the humanities demand changes in how we approach our data and the way that we understand it. But not simply a response, I might note, but how we can get at a deeper set of questions that transcend any one tradition. And in the process, try to ascertain what these questions and the answers to which they give rise say about human creativity and perseverance. So this initiative is thus meant to engage scholars in, for lack of a better term, comparative studies of what we're calling culturally central texts, the social dynamics that they provoke or tend to engender, their structural and ideological roles, along with research on those who claim to provide large in-groups with the proper meaning of such texts. To achieve this goal, this project aims at establishing regular sessions at academic meetings such as the IAHR, the SBL, the International SBL, the EASR, the AAR, among others, including a set of webinars, with this being the first, willing to support projects and aims. Now, rather than wax theoretical about all this, I thought it might be nice to jump into something practical to see what we have in mind. So allow me to introduce today's speaker, Steed Vernyl Davidson. Now, Dr. Davidson serves as the executive director of the Society of Biblical Literature. He is also extraordinary visiting professor of the Old Testament in the Department of Old and New Testament at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. When not running the SBL ship, he has held teaching positions where he has taught the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament from a Old Testament from a post-colonial perspective. His most recent publications include the co-edited volume along with L. Juliana Claessens and Charlene Vanderwalt and Ashwin Tyson called Queering the Prophet on Jonah and Other Activists. As I mentioned, following Dr. Davidson's presentation, I'll respond to it as best I can for 5-10 minutes, and then we will hand over to the audience members. So, without any further ado, allow me to give the screen to Dr. Davidson. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Hughes, for this invitation and opportunity to participate in this new and exciting venture. So today I'm spending some time trying to figure out something that I've been trying to figure out for a very long time. As a biblical scholar, I am interested in the ways in which the Bible is used, particularly in contexts that don't seem very obvious for the Bible. And one of those contexts has always, for me, has been Rastafari and the way in which they use biblical texts. This is so much of a puzzle because Rastafari functions mostly as an oral tradition. But the oral traditions and the oral practices derive from several written texts. So it's this unique and peculiar relationship where textuality and orality exist simultaneously. I think, of course, intuitively we may think of these as successive phases in the development and evolution of a religious movement or even a social movement. But for Rastafari, they sit close together, and then the relationships aren't always as easily mapped as we would like to think. So, so what I want to do today is to look at those types of relationships, the relationships between the various texts, and they reveal what they do. They reveal creation of authoritative texts out of pre-existing texts and the creation of new ones, as well as the process of decentering previously authoritative central texts in other areas. So I find it a very fascinating phenomena, and I can't completely explain it in this time that we have, but it is certainly something that I just want to lay out here. I'm using the term scripturalization as evolved and developed by Vincent Wimbush. And as best as I could give you a very sort of succinct definition in his own words, is that it is a social, psychological, political structure that plays off previous texts for the sake of resistance, survival, freedom, and independent thriving. So there's a body of central texts, cultural central texts. Scripturalization comes along and navigates and creates a new relationship with those texts, because the two sides of his definition are important: the social, psychological, political structure. And you could hear in all of that issues of oppression, domination, and all of those sorts of things. And then the response of generating new texts or responding to those texts for the purposes of survival, etc. So, of course, the contact zones that we're looking at where scripturalization takes place is fraught with conflict. Scripturalization is a response to a hostile worldview and its traditions. So let me just outline what I plan to do is to talk about Rastafari so you can get some background for those of you who don't have a full sense of it. And I'll try to, and in the process, situate these texts and delineate the major texts that guide them. And finally, I'll try to assess how the texts play with one another. So let's look at some origins. And I thought just some of the four basic questions: who, what, when, where, why, and that sort of a thing. So Rastafari is the product of the urban Jamaican underclass. And even though I'm situating it within an urban environment, it really started to take off among rural peasants in this rural parish of St. Thomas, because there are many things that happened there. It emerges in the post-emancipation Jamaica during the time of British colonialism. Rastafari captures the rising nationalist sentiments that mark the 1930s. So it's still the early days, well, not the early days, the midpoint of British colonialism. It hasn't started to decline. That decline is going to come in the 1950s somewhat. But still, the 1930s, if you were, globally, it is not a very fun time to be in. Economic malaise and disenchantment is characteristic of the society in Jamaica. And these, of course, are placed, these economic malaise and disenchantment are the products of the failures of British institutions to address issues worldwide, but within the Jamaican context, issues and the legacies of slavery and the post-slavery period. The sense that European traditions are an ill fit to the needs of the black population begin to take hold, especially among urban populations. And the critique is targeted at centers of power, the government, the church, Christian church, largely a source of domination, education, another one of those tools, and in law enforcement, which of course, as you could see, is a way in which to control the populations, especially when there are thoughts and actions that seem to be disturbing. So you have this response and this reaction to what are seen as the impositions on the society at the behest of British imperial colonialism. The critique of this situation offered a vision of black uplift built upon wisdom, African wisdom, and African traditions. And of course, this response was to offer a corrective to the persistent negative portrayal of blackness. Now, this level of consciousness that we're seeing among the population would have started much earlier in the 19th century through a concept that scholars will regard as Ethiopianism. And Ethiopianism emerges, many believe, from Southern Africa. And it is a catch-all phrase that represents in some ways black pride. Ethiopia within the African context is seen as the one uncolonized space on the continent. And therefore, given the fact that you have a geographic area untouched by white colonialism, and even further untouched by white Christian missionary activity, Ethiopia functions as this emblem of African freedom. But it doesn't stay in Africa. It then spreads through the consciousness of black populations across the world. So Ethiopianism becomes a feature of Pan-Africanist thought. Towards the end of the 19th century, we start to see it emerging in several different places. And it spread in many ways because of the movement of intellectuals who in the late 19th century, even the 20th century, circulated among what we will call the Black Atlantic. So you had major speakers who would go from one country to the next and would talk about these ideas. But it gets a stronger spread in the early 20th century from those who served in the Great War, the military, during the Great War, as well as those who participated in the building of the Panama Canal, because that was a space of extractive labor from parts of the Caribbean to Panama. The concept of Ethiopianism it builds upon Psalm 68, verse 31. And in the King James Version, which is what most persons would have been reading, it says, "Princes shall come out of Egypt. Ethiopia shall soon stretch out her hands unto God." And this idea of the rise of Ethiopia, this sort of sense that Ethiopia as a place is preferred by God, provides this strong confidence of black pride and in many ways an anticipation that the current situation will not be the same as it will change over time. And so we'll see it among a number of different persons. I just raised up two, and I'll talk about them later on. George Liele, who is exiled to Jamaica from Savannah, Georgia, because Liele participates with the British in the U.S. Revolutionary War. And when the war was over, he and several others were expelled. He went to Jamaica. There were two that were sent into Nova Scotia. So there were three of them who were leaders in a church in Savannah that was known as the First Ethiopian Baptist Church. And we'll see this in several different places where Africans are being referred to as Ethiopians, and black churches take the title of Ethiopia. And then another person is Marcus Garvey, a Pan-African leader at the start of the 20th century. Leonard Howell, who is credited with kind of advancing the movement, imbibed Psalm 68:31. And when Howell reads it as a prediction, and a prophetic prediction at that. And he sees the enthronement of Haile Selassie as the fulfillment of that prophecy. And essentially what Howell is going to be teaching is how Haile Selassie is the promised Messiah, is a son of God, is divine, and is the fulfillment of African hopes. And hence the name Rastafari, because it reflects the throne name that Selassie uses. Ras is an honorific, and Tafari being the name. Not unusual in the Ethiopian context. So Howell then begins this movement that is built upon this foundation of the divinity of Haile Selassie as the fulfillment of a verse in Psalm 68 and verse 31. Here are a list of the people who I've been talking about before. Like I said, Liele was a leader in the church in Savannah, Georgia, and was expelled. But he also had these Ethiopianist ideas. Garvey, if you know, is one of Garvey's movement was one of the largest Pan-African movement in the world at the start of the 20th century. And Howell, who within the context of colonial Jamaica is seen as an agitator, and they tried to silence him because they thought he was seditious, and that those sorts of things. And Howell, I'll have this text a little later on. Basically, what he understands is the fact that when Haile Selassie is enthroned, you had probably like 50 something different heads, representatives from different countries going to that enthronement, among which was the Duke of Gloucester, the crown prince of the British throne. And Howell understands that if the crown prince of the British Empire goes to this event, it represents a subservience of the British Empire to the Ethiopian dynasty. But the thing I want to talk about are the texts. So let's just look at them a bit. There are a few that I want to describe. As I indicated, much of the sort of the thought of Rastafari is centered, takes off from the Bible. And I want to describe in some ways, what I think are three related moves that are happening among Rastafarian written texts. It's this process of decentering, recentering, and centering. And it begins with the rejection of the King James Bible. This major move of decentering the text. It is rejected because it is seen as a white Bible, that it was produced by white people, for their interest. And much of this, of course, is a reaction to the ways in which this Bible is used to justify slavery, oppression, and all sorts of things, and the way it marks and marshals an argument for black insufficiency. So it is rejected. But the issue here is that there's an understanding that there's a different Bible. And that Bible within the scope of Rastafari is referred to as the Maccabee version. Now, the Maccabee version that they're thinking of is the longer Christian canon that includes a deuterocanonical work, which of course in it is the book of Maccabees. And of course, what you have in the book of Maccabees is this very revolutionary disposition of a group of people who are fighting against an empire. And it feels very appealing within for Black consciousness. But the other thing that commends this Bible is that it is the Bible of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. And so in the logic was why it is that this unmissionized Christian church in Africa, why do they have this Bible? And the Bible that comes with white Christian missionaries is shorter and is oppressive. Clearly something is up. And what you have is this rejection of the King James Version in preference for the longer canon. Max Romeo, one of the sort of reggae singer, talks about it, the Maccabee version that God gave to black man. So you have this move of rejecting and decentering the King James Bible in preference for recentering this longer canon as superior to it. And out of course, so that any appeals to a biblical text is not really to the King James Version, but it is to the Maccabee version. And there are various texts that are used to talk about this, which is, Psalm 68 against Psalm 72 does this, and particularly Genesis 49:10. For Genesis 49:10 is really seen to be working during the coronation of Selassie, this confirmation of what's happening there. Now, there's this other text called the Kebra Nagast, which is the 14th century text that has been around in Ethiopia, for a very long time. It plays this crucial role in the national heritage of Ethiopia. And what this text does, among other things, is to trace the origins of the imperial dynasty to Menelik. Menelik being the son of Solomon and Makeda, who most scholars seem to agree, to some extent, might well be the Queen of Sheba. At least scholars of the Kebra Nagast see how Ethiopians understand that Makeda is the Queen of Sheba as represented in 1 Kings 10. And this is what becomes of interest to Rastafari, because then it amplifies the Ethiopian claims that in the Kebra, the challenge, it amplifies the challenge to the Bible, where they can see someone like Solomon becomes subordinate to the queen, to an African queen. And the Kebra Nagast provides Rastafari with a replacement text for the biblical account and an alternative history. So the two texts, this Maccabee version and Kebra Nagast, complement each other, but they do not, of course, don't tell a complete story on their own, because what they work as is foundational texts to fill out two major beliefs. One, in the divinity of Haile Selassie, and two, in the importance of a Black-centered worldview. So I want to talk about some others, what I'm trying not to regard as secondary texts, because I do not believe that the Bible and the Kebra Nagast have primacy. I'll talk about this a little bit later. But here are a few other texts that were generated a little closer to the origins of Rastafari. One is called the Holy Pibi, well, the Holy Pibi, the Royal Parchment Scroll of Black Supremacy, and the Promised Key. The Holy Pibi is published in Anguilla around 1924 by someone named Robert Athley Rogers. Um, and, and, and Rogers articulates what Rastafari will become. Because when Rogers writes this, Rastafari is not on the scene as yet. This is 1924. But what Rogers is articulating is aspirations for an African-centered religion that rejects white Christianity. And his work is going to be critical for people like Howell. And then there's this other text that written by Fitz Ballantyne Petersburg in 1926 in Jamaica called the Royal Parchment Scroll of Black Supremacy. Again, it's another text that predates Rastafari. And in it, you get a strong Ethiopianist worldview where Petersburg thinks of Jamaicans as the Africans who are the remnant out of which a resurgent Africa will come. And this is an important thing because what it shows is that the ground was already being mined for what will become for Rastafari will become. But it also shows that they're performing these kind of moves textually in relation to this dominant text that the society wants them to ascribe to. And what you're getting is constant rejection of that text, i.e. the Bible and other kinds of texts, and the production of these reactionary texts. Now, the critical one that, if you want to call it a primary text for Rastafari, is the Promised Key. The Promised Key is written in 1935 by Leonard Howell. And this is where he distills a whole lot of sort of basic Rastafari thought. But what Howell does is that he draws heavily from the Holy Pibi that Rogers written, and a little bit more from the Royal Parchment. He doesn't do a lot of original work, but he's trying to use this as a way to lay out some major things. In the orbit of these texts are several others, to which I will talk about. One called The Testimony of His Imperial Majesty, which is an anthology of writings by Carl Philpott. Somewhere in the 1970s, he puts this together. And this features reflections on spirituality, thoughts about Haile Selassie and divinity, etc. And it will show up in a few places. There's another one called The Third Testament of Ilect Verses. And this is a collection of selected speeches of Haile Selassie that Miguel Lorne, again, somewhere in the 60s, put together. If you're going to have your major deity, you need direct words from the deity to function as a sort of a central text. And the others that I'm talking about didn't do that, and hence the sense of a third testament that Lorne produces. And then there is another one that I forgot. The Speeches of Marcus Garvey was another one that has been included. So a little bit inside the text. In the Royal Parchment, Petersburg, of course, calls for what he calls for a new dictionary, a new Bible, a new board of education, a new money mint, right? Very major sectors of the society. What he is asking for is for this fundamental change that needs to happen. And it is consistent with a kind of critique that Rastafari will bring, because the critique is not just simply about spiritual things, if you want to call it that. It's a remake of the entire society. And then in the Holy Pibi, which we got from Rogers, it's this very militant posture that makes a very sharp rebuttal to Europeans. And you'll find a verse like, "O people of Ethiopia, boast not the progress of the white race, believing that you are part of the project." And again, you see the language of Ethiopia as a way to talk about Africans. And also in the Holy Pibby, it's Rogers styling himself as a shepherd, as a successor and inheritor of Marcus Garvey, and encouraging people. And then in the promised key, which is what we would have from Howell, again, that's a direct quote in the promised key of the way in which he reads the coronation of Haile Selassie and the British prince's involvement in that and what that means and what that signals. And one of the things that happened that many scholars will believe why Rastafari took off at the time it did in relation to Haile Selassie was that this was a very public and visual event that unlike this was unlike anything happening in Africa, where you have the world focus upon the coronation of an African royal. And it was attended by a large international audience. It was covered by major newspapers around the world. So it stirs the imagination of a number of people. And for Rastafari, it really makes a striking statement about Blackness at that point in time. So one of the things we could say about the texts that are being generated to occupy a space within Rastafari is that they are fairly imitative of previous texts, or imitative of what we would understand as scriptures. They're following the form. So like the Holy Pibby picks up a lot of the language and the language expressions and the phraseology of the King James Bible, like it came to pass, verily I say unto you, etc., right? So this is very heavy 16th century English style that it portrays. Also, in Howell's work on the royal parchment, what he does is he creates this structure that follows largely the structure of the Bible. It begins with creation, talks about the proclamation of the law, a divine messenger coming, which is Marcus Garvey, heaven, hell, etc., etc. So that he is rewriting the Bible, and what he's doing is eliminating all of those pieces that he finds objectionable and putting in place these African elements, and of course reconceptualizing it in some other ways as well. So I don't think it's just simply imitation per se in the way in which we want to think of it in a derogatory way. It includes, of course, a divine messenger who he names Douglas, and many people suspect that the Douglas could be Frederick Douglass. But what you're seeing is a certain set of moves that are being made. Another thing that Rogers does in the Holy Pibby is that he will have a version of commandments, and these are 12 commandments. There would be a shepherd's prayer, which is akin to a prayer of Jesus. And the striking thing about those two and several others is that they do not emphasize personal piety. They're very heavily focused upon communal piety and communal responsibility as well. Interestingly, it must be said that the royal parchment that Howell put together was he used a pseudonym for while he was to write it. So here's what I've been trying to say about how I can map the relationship between these between these texts. As you could see, I'm talking about the sidelining of the King James Version and it being superseded by what's called the Maccabee version. And that, as along with the Kebra Nagast, in some ways are going to feed ideas into the Holy PB. The royal parchment may draw upon that as well, and I should have put an arrow here where the royal parchment does. But all of these produce the promised key where Howell is distilling those different types of texts. And in the orbit of all of these are these texts that I have named, plus some other minor texts, if you want to call them that, because they may be very minor from the sense that they are localized to the different Rastafari groups, as well as some other things that may be at play. So what does all of this mean is that I'm talking about this sense of fluidity between texts, that there is no central text as such. There are many texts that feed and play off of each other. But in the production of texts that play off of one another, what you have are several different types of moves of rejection and rebuilding. The kinds of moves that you would see that are characteristic of maroons, maroonage, where there's a movement away from, but it is not just, that's not the only move. There are these multiple moves of rebuilding and reconstruction. Despite the heavy use of the style of what's, we will want to call scripture, the mimicry that I'm seeing here shouldn't really be understood as just basic imitation. I understand it from the perspective that Homi Baba talks about mimicry, that is not simply copying, but it is an attempt to present a version that is recognizable, but it is recognizable as being other. So that it is strikingly a frontal assault on all of the regimes associated with the Bible in a way that says we are not this and we are something else. That sense of understanding how power invades with texts is certainly what Wimbush talks about, where someone who is positioned to books is basically seen as more powerful or thought to be more powerful. So you do have Rastafari kind of drawing on that in their sort of production of texts, but they don't stay there, because then those texts are only the stepping stones for a verbal centering of authority and idea making and meaning production. Central to sort of Rastafari gathering is this event known as reasoning. And reasoning occurs after the ritual ingestion of the holy weed. And it is a space that's democratic and open, where people get to offer commentary and reflection, and they will comment on text, and it could include the biblical text, and it could include some of those earlier texts. But reasoning is the space where the intricacies of thought and thinking and meaning generation is happening at a higher level than what a text will offer. Of course, there's some problems there with this issues of reasoning is very male-centered. It excluded women, and the women can't necessarily find a way into that space. And very interestingly, the category known as Rasta women, and Rasta women is a category of women who come to the movement just like men, rather than women who are partnered with a Rasta man. Rasta women, because they don't have a space within that verbal centering of meaning, find other forms of production for their own ideas, which tends now to be writing, once again, sometimes cultural production, art, etc., and so on. So to close off then, just to say that the case of Rastafari demonstrates the outcome of an encounter with textual traditions that purport universal coverage. Survival under such regimes or in the face of such regimes require subversions and interventions. Now, these are processes that Wimbush understands as scriptural ethics, a result of scripturalization. And you could read that longer quote from his work from 2017. There are several moves that are involved. And I'm intrigued that Rastafari gives us a case study to see some of these types of moves that are at work, and this wonderful way where there is a space beyond the regimes of texts and the culture of texts that in some ways can become really problematic. Well, I think I may have gone over my time. Let me stop there, and hopefully there is space for us to have some conversation.
Muted. Thank you so much, Steed. That was appreciated. I learned a lot from that. So let me try to make sense of your wonderful talk for someone who is outside of the specific area of the case study. And so I thought the best way would be me to respond, I guess, is to sort of summarize what I got out of it, and maybe and then begin to ask a few questions with various levels. So maybe originally some sort of clarificatory ones, at least for me. Hopefully other people will find useful, and then try to work up to a more forest-like approach. And then, as I said, so maybe I'll give the response, ask some questions, allow you to respond, and then we'll open it up to other people to do so. So to sum up, then, what I got out of your fascinating lecture, and you can either confirm, dismiss, or nuance it, is that Rastafari has its beginning, like so many social movements, in the desire for autonomy, be it social, political, or the like. And perhaps this is just another way of saying that culturally central texts do not simply fall from heaven, but are the product of human creativity and the need to justify or legitimate social and political change, if in fact we can separate the two. Indeed, I might even go so far as to argue that what we call quote unquote religious, aware of all the critiques in the study of religion about the Westo-Eurocentric and Christocentric notion of that term, is but a byproduct of the social and political orders. Now, in order to do this, you give us the notion of decentering, recentering, and centering texts, which for me at least forms the heart of your remarks. As I understand them, decentering involves removing the King James Version from its centrality, its immediate central position on Eurocentric and colonial contexts, which somehow leads to or coincides with, and here I might ask for a little bit more clarification, but I'll make this clear in a second, Steed, a recentering or the creation of a new form of textuality that derives from a more expansive Christian canon, presumably without the same Eurocentric overtones, namely that which has been embraced by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and then subsequently centering, or I guess it's now that the center has been cleared, decentered and reset, is centering it with this the 14th century Kebra Nagast and other texts, these interpretive texts, as I understand them, that come from the early 20th century and maybe mid 20th century, that have played a crucial role. If the Kebra Nagast has played a crucial role in Ethiopian national heritage, these other interpretive texts in this sort of pan-African notion. Now, so added to the textuality of the Kebra Nagast and what I think you call it the Maccabean text, is the orality, or oral Torah, if you will, that not only connects these texts, perhaps canonical texts, to one another, but also to the community through ritual activity, the smoking of marijuana that presumably dulls the senses and opens the mind to the purported deity in an activity that's called reasoning. So I hope I have that right. And so with that in mind, I want to ask a few questions. I'll ask them all in hopefully there's a coherence to the way in which I ask them. But maybe the first one is this idea of the mechanism of decentering, recentering, and centering. Are they chronological? Do they overlap? Is it does one obviously one can only recenter after one is decentered, but I'm kind of interested in the chronological dimension of that. The second one, again, at the sort of level of trees, is it the case that Rastafari need a text of universal significance, aka the version of the Hebrew Bible, one that is particular to the Ethiopic context, for example, the Kebra Nagast, and then their own traditions, such as the Promised Key and these other texts that you brought our attention to bring them into conversation with one another. And I'm wondering if that's a fair representation. How do the texts differ from one another? Is one more important? Does the Maccabean version hold the key? And do the other texts have competing roles and even different modes of interpretation? I also like how you state that authoritative texts come about by a set of what you call relationships between pre-existing texts as well as new ones, and that these relationships can actually subvert traditional hegemonic structures, namely that of British colonialism. Now, I wonder if this is a common feature of culturally central texts, that they can all be decentered, recentered, and centered. But at the same time, again, and asking you from your particular case study, but maybe being aware of some of the larger significance beyond that, are there limits, what the rabbis called hedges around the Torah, that limit such process? And how might this work with Rastafari traditions? And then to me, this goes back to the reasoning, and that is, I mean, I guess one of the main features of all culturally central texts is that they demand, not just need, but demand interpretation, which of course leads to the question of authority. Who has the authority to interpret these texts? And what determines such authority? I mean, you said it was the purview of males. Are all males, males elite, male elites? Can anyone engage in reasoning? And then I think all these sort of more basic questions to me lead to a couple of larger ones, and that is, you know, in the humanities we talk a lot about decolonialization in the academy, and which is now, you know, percolated over into other constituencies. And I wonder how culturally central texts, with the Rastafari case study that you've given us, how can they contribute to this larger process? Which of course is also related to the idea of, you know, what is the main takeaway about that we get from your case study about culturally central texts? So, for example, I'm working Islamic studies. How can someone who works with, say, the Quran or the Hadith, what does your case study have to say to those of us that work with other case studies? And I think that's the key, is we have to think of all of us as working in case studies. And this is why this webinar is so important, because it's a way we can connect our own specific case studies to one another. So those are kind of my questions in various levels of to stay with the forest metaphor, various levels of going from trees to forests to helicopters.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yes. Yeah. To say your summation was accurate. I don't have any corrections to make there. So I'm glad that my writing was clear enough for you to pick it up. On the question of the chronology, I think yes, there is a chronology, and I would talk about it in the way in which you described it, except I would add that it's a circular process, that it doesn't come to an end, that it just keeps manifesting itself. Now, clearly, much of my uh, thinking here is based upon what Rastafari looks like up to a certain point in time. Given that Rastafari has evolved, where there are less compounds and communal living, where people can embrace the religion without belonging per se to a group, or if they belong, those belongings are prescribed by the local situation. this process will keep going, and it can look very differently from one group to the next, or even what I think maybe from one, what we see now might not be what we would have seen 10 years ago. Your question about whether the need for a universally significant text is an intriguing one, and I don't know how to answer it in terms of whether they needed that, except this is kind of what they were working with. That you have now this huge imposition of Europeanness and its textual traditions that for all sorts of historical and other reasons gained power. So that's the thing that you have to come up against. And I suspect clearly it helps that they could find textual traditions from that deep within history, like the Kebra Nagast, and the enduring dynasty of the Ethiopians that could match and in fact surpass what the Europeans had to offer. So I think that there's a way in which those become an important thing. My suspicion and or essentially suspicion, my hunch is that what I'm describing is much more common about this category of culturally central text than we want to think. We tend to approach kind of dominant texts from a static point of view, that they retain their power and influence over time in the same way, and we don't always pay attention to the kinds of shifts that are occurring. And when I say we don't pay attention to that, the way in which the movement talks about the text tends to ignore that and downplay that, because to the extent that you signal that the text is that fluid and open for interpretation, is to the extent to which you undermine its authoritativeness. So I think Rastafari come already with this idea that we're not reliant on the text for authority and to do that kind of a guidance. So I think hence the ease and comfort with performing those kinds of moves. Now, one of the interesting things about Rastafari is that it wanted to distinguish itself from other African-derived religions in Jamaica. One of the major features of those religions is spirit possession, and they just did not deal with spirit possession, and so the intoxicant of marijuana is the replacement for it. That's where the consciousness is opened up for in their world access the divine. And the feature that I'm exposing here is important, because while there are some hierarchies in Rastafari, right? Men above women, older men above younger men, etc., etc., there really is no institutional hierarchy per se. Hence the kind of freedom and fluidity that enables the text to do the kinds of work that it is doing. So I think in terms of the takeaway is, what does it look like when you have a movement that's much more democratized than several others, where you have instituted hierarchies that control meaning and control interpretation? How do culturally central texts operate when the movement looks like that? But it's also, I think, an important question to ask when you do have such moribund institutions as hierarchies as well. What are people doing with those culturally central texts in ways that may avoid scrutiny, but in ways that may be generating the kind of meaning that are important for them, that keeps them in the movement? So those are Well, and then you asked about the contribution to decolonization, definitely. But this is one of my interests. I got into this because of my interest in post-colonial work. And it was my sense of the Rastafari is showing me what a kind of truly post-colonial, decolonial reading of the Bible looks like. Where what you have is fundamental rejection of some of the premises. And the sort of other spaces where I have to navigate is wouldn't allow for those types of rejections to take place. And to the extent that you don't go in that in those directions, are you really decolonizing? Yeah, so I'll leave it there.
All right. I will. Thank you. Thank you for that. Anyone would like to ask further questions, either clarificatory or analytic? Wait for see if
Steed, I speak.
yeah, please, Ehud.
Yeah.
Well, I have plenty of questions, and probably we'll have to talk separately about them.
Offline, yes.
But just a few of them. The Maccabean Bible they refer, which is the Orthodox Ethiopian Bible, I assume was rendered into English,
Yep.
not in Geese.
That's right.
So
That's
raise
right.
the question of the issue of translation, control or lack of control, or fluidity of translation, performance of translation. Would you like to talk a bit the same by the way about the Cabre, no?
Yeah. No. Well, I mean, there are these obvious contradictions in the process. I have not been able to track whether the English version that they were using was a King James translation, because they certainly it would not have been. I'm trying to think. The authorized version, which would not have come out of 1611, would have had the one with the Deuterocanonicals that they were using. So, but for the most part, whatever English that they're accessing is in the same family line of translation of the King James version. And not quite different from it. But I think the powerful thing here is their sense that this does not come from Europe. It comes from Africa.
Okay.
Yeah, and the same similarly with the Kebra. I think by that time there were many English translations, and I have not tracked down either how those translations have worked, who did them, and so on. So they would have gotten.
And the text will have been read orally in Jamaican English or in King James Version English?
They would read it in King James Version. They read it in King James. Because as you could see, I sent Aaron copies of those texts if you wanted to read them. I find them fascinating reading. The three that I talk about. I mean, the writing style is very formal, very reflective of it. So they do capture the nuances of what it means to write something that resembles a scripture.
Okay. While at the same time decentralizing it.
Yes.
Which is a very interesting process.
Right. Yeah. It's kind of picking up on these practices and then dropping them after you've kind of made your point or gained power from using them.
Yeah.
All right. Any other questions? There seems to be, there's a question in the chat, Steed, if you want to. Maybe does everyone have access to the chat, or just us?
So one of the things about Rastafari's relationship with Ethiopia, like I said, it draws out of this broader conception of Ethiopianism, which and Ethiopianism in the 19th century as a sort of philosophical thought, if you wish, isn't always coterminous with the nation state of Ethiopia. Um, and 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 there are decades and history, centuries of this sort of a relationship that what's called that, and we will see this even in the Hebrew Bible itself, is the reference to Ethiopia always what we understand as this, and then the names shifts as well, Abyssinia and all sorts of things. So there's that murkiness that's not unique to Rastafari. Some of that is going to clarify itself as people understood what's at stake. And one of the sort of places where that clarification takes place is when Mussolini invades Ethiopia. And now people understand Ethiopia not simply as a sort of a mythical, divine space, but an actual nation state facing some of the same sort of issues of any nation. And you will see someone like Marcus Garvey working overtime to make sure that there is support for Selassie and getting him reinstated. Garvey in his writings just critiquing a lot of Western oversight of what the Italians are doing in Ethiopia. Now, the fact that Selassie is able to get back in resolves a lot of the contradictions that may have emerged relative to all of those things. So for Rastafari, it's more Ethiopia and the politics of Ethiopia rather than the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church functions in a way to give them a biblical imprint that they could work off of. Here's one of the interesting things that will happen is that Rastafari starts to grow up alongside of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, right? And there are branches of it in Jamaica, different parts of the Caribbean. And the Ethiopian Orthodox Church in the 60s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s took on the character of a Rastafari church. That it was kind of like a Christian version of Rastafari. So that it really worked in the other direction of how Rastafari impacted the Ethiopian Orthodox Church outside of Ethiopia. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Following this question, you have the Italian invasion, but also you have the actual fall of Haile Selassie and his dynasty. And he didn't come back to reign nor the dynasty. So how Rastafari
Yeah, it's kind of, I can't remember specifically all of the things that they did, but it is the sort of thing that that movements do with inconvenient truths. They find ways to rationalize them,
Yeah.
or just overlook them. And I think there's a combination of both that he was deposed for incompetence or whatever all of the reasons were. You don't see that mentioned a whole lot among Rastafari. A lot of it is essentially downplayed, and if there's a mention of it, it is almost like what will happen in the assessment of someone like Solomon, that the sin was not as great as the achievement.
Yeah.
But it doesn't diminish the stature of the person.
But what about the descendants? Is only Haile Selassie?
That's
There are
right.
no
Yes.
descendants.
Yeah. No association with his descendants. Yeah. Mhm.
Well,
I mean, ultimately, and even though they have been, because I don't think any of his descendants became emperor. Right. So that's like another way that inconvenient truth kind of works in their favor, where they didn't have to pay attention to who came afterwards.
all right. Well, any other further questions, or if not, I think this has been a excellent inaugural webinar, and hope to build on this. I mean, to build on this from strength to strength. So stay tuned for another announcement for the next installment. But again, Dr. Davidson, I would like to thank you so much for your wonderfully informative talk. And I appreciate it very much. And I'd like to thank everybody for attending, although we're slowly, depending on where people are, they're probably falling asleep as they're talking. But thank you for attending. And as I said, stay tuned for the next installment. And I guess if there's no other questions or comments, if anyone wants to add, I will say good afternoon or good night to everybody.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Very much. Yep.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Steve. Thank you.